Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 6. August to September 1915. 24th of August, 1915. Dear Miss Hughes, I write to you from my new post at the 47th Ambulance in a location I am not allowed to tell you about. The 47th is not a vehicle, but a main dressing station, though it does also have several ambulances, both motor and horse. We are based out of a building that used to be a school and is still mostly standing up, and are a fairly large station, more like a small hospital really. We have a full operating theater, dispensary, and enough space that the patients can stay on our wards if they only need a couple of weeks to recover from whatever's troubling them. Any longer than that, and they get sent for the rec. So far, my contribution to all this has been in the form of making beds and things like that. There are 5 of us new fellows. Most of the other orderlies have been here for ages, so we are starting out with the simplest work. The experienced men were all glad to have us come, as they have been short-handed for some time, and so have been very welcoming. We are about, crossed out, miles behind the front line, and so are very safe here. The sector has been quiet, so I haven't had to go forward to collect wounded yet. Every few days, word goes around that the ward master, who is the man in charge of us orderlies, has said that we new blokes ought to be taken up to get the lie of the land while things are still quiet. But something else always comes up for us to do here instead. Thank you for the biscuits. If you send more, you might look for the kind that come in a tin. Our billet has mice. Thomas. When Anna looked up from the letter, Miss Hughes said, "It sounds as though he's in fairly good spirits." There was a hint of a question in her tone, and she nodded. "He does know that the ones he writes to you get passed around to everyone, but he didn't say anything too different to me. They're near enough to the artillery that they can hear it. Our artillery, I mean, but a good distance behind it. The things like that is mostly to do with bedpans, which I suppose he thought was a bit indelicate to tell you about. And his billets in a barn, which he's about as pleased about as you'd expect, but he isn't taking it personally." She gave the letter back. "He mentioned the tin to me as well, so I suppose we had best find one. The village shop was out of biscuits and tins when I checked." "I expect we have a tin somewhere in this house," Miss Hughes pointed out. "Perhaps Daisy would bake something to go in it." "You might like that," Anna agreed. 29th of August, 1915. Dear Thomas, I'm glad to hear you're someplace safe, even if you don't like your billet. I don't imagine I'd like sleeping in a barn either, especially not with mice. The shop was all out of biscuits and tins, but Miss Hughes and I found this one in the storeroom, and we've put some of Daisy's ginger nuts in it. She remembered that you like them. Perhaps they'll cheer you and the others up a bit about the barn. Love, Anna Smith. Thomas groaned on reading the note that came with his parcel. He supposed Anna was right, that he ought to share the biscuits with the others in the billet. The 47th did not, he had learned, adopt the communist policy in regards to biscuits that Peter had described, perhaps because there were a few buggers who would abuse the system. But most evenings there was a sort of social hour in the barn, between getting back there after dinner and everyone setting down to sleep, where the contents of bottles and parcels were shared, and everyone talked as they took care of their kit, played cards, or simply lay on their bedrolls and smoked. Thomas avoided these gatherings as much as possible. If he didn't have any work to do on his kit, he came up with some excuse to walk back to the billet on his own instead of with the crowd, and then took a longer route, stopping for a solitary cigarette or two on the way. It wasn't that anything particularly objectionable happened in them, although Thomas could have done without some of the discussion on the subject of women. But he had never before realized how essential to his peace of mind it was to be able to go into his bedroom at the end of the day and shut the bloody door, even when he'd had to share with another footman, or with Jamie when he'd been younger. He'd at least occasionally had the room to himself. When you were sharing a barn with a dozen other men, that never happened. It had been the same in the tent at training camp, of course, but it seemed worse now, perhaps because the work was more strenuous, or perhaps the strain of it was just building up on him. Particularly the strain of not being, as Bates had put it, a complete tit. Keeping his head down and not saying what was on his mind had worked out well for him so far, and he wanted to keep doing it, but it was hard, especially when one or another of the section was being particularly annoying. But while he could just about get away with keeping to himself, keeping his biscuits to himself was a different story altogether. A man who was a bit quiet, but all right, might make a habit of having a bit of a walk and a smoke by himself of an evening, keeping away from the billet so that he could smuggle his biscuits in under cover of darkness was surely the action of a complete tit. With utmost reluctance, he got up and turned his steps toward the barn. It sat on its own between two weed-choked fields. The house that had once belonged to it shelled into rubble. The only positive thing that could be said about it was that it did not stink of manure, probably because it had been unfit for the shelter of cattle for years before the war started. It had thick, sturdy stone walls, but the wooden roof might as well have been a sieve. Many of the boards were loose enough to flap on windy days. Honestly, he was surprised the mice chose to live there. The men it housed had no choice, being the newest in the unit. 4 had come over with Thomas and the rest in earlier drafts that year. When he got to the barn, after picking his way to his spot through the maze of men and their belongings, he unrolled his ground sheet and blankets. You had to stow them every morning, even though the idea of anyone conducting a barracks inspection in this place was laughable, because that way you at least had a chance of some of your things staying dry if it rained. Then opened his biscuit tin, took a couple, and passed it to Lamble, who had the place next to his. "No, thanks," Lamble said, breaking off one of his long and pointless anecdotes. "Do it. All these are mine." "Sort of," Thomas said. They were made in somebody's home anyway. "The first biscuits my sister ever tried to bake with ginger nuts," Lamble noted, passing the tin to the next man, Rawlkins, who was one of the old-timers in their section, having come over at the end of February. "Only she put in black pepper instead of ginger. Don't ask me how." Lamble kept talking about his sister's biscuits, but Thomas stopped listening. That was one thing about having so many of them in the billet. Some bugger was always talking, and more often than not it was Lamble. But if he said something requiring a reply, you could generally count on somebody else making it. He checked his kit, all in good order, and was about to light another cigarette when he noticed Rawlkins holding out a bottle of wine. Lamble, instead of taking it, scooted back on his bedroll as if it might burn him. He hadn't been in Thomas's section in training, but Thomas vaguely remembered he was one of the lot that, when the rest went to the pub, buggered off to the godmother's hut for cocoa and a sing-along instead. Leaning across Lamble to grab the bottle, he told Rawkins, "He's Methodist." "Quaker, actually," said Lamble. "Really? That was a little hard to imagine." Nearly the only thing Thomas knew about Quakers was that they went to church by sitting silently in a room, which he knew for the same reason everyone did. Because of the children's game called Quaker Meeting, which he was convinced had been invented by some harassed mum or dad who wanted a moment's peace. The one who could sit in complete silence for the longest, without even laughing or smiling, was the winner. Lamble would be terrible at that game. But he just shrugged and said, "Sorry. Knew it was one of the teetotal nonconformist ones." Plank, another old-timer, sat up on his bedroll. "How in the hell do you manage that?" he asked. Lamble started yammering about something called the peace testimony and the choice of serving in a non-combatant capacity being a matter for the conscience of the individual. It was actually one of the more interesting things Thomas had ever heard him say, but by the time he started in on the Friends ambulance unit, which was apparently working with the French because the British Army wouldn't have them, everyone else was looking around and murmuring things like, "What's he on about?" "But I wanted to serve my country," Lamble concluded. "And besides, there weren't very many places in the FAU, and the elders in my meeting are against it anyway, so I decided to do this." And long and awkward silence followed his pronouncement. Finally, Thomas decided that no one else was going to say it. "He meant the bloody meetings, mate, because you never shut up. Not why you're not a country." Realizing belatedly that he had probably just insulted all of Lamble's friends and relations back home, he added, "Incha subjecta." "Oh," said Lamble, and was silent for a long moment. "Well, it's actually a common misunderstanding that meetings for worship are silent. We don't have a priest or minister, you see, so there's no sermon. But any member of the meeting can speak if he's moved to do so by the Spirit of God." That raised another question, which Thomas found himself asking before he'd quite considered the wisdom of it. How in hell did the rest of them manage you, then? As soon as he'd said it, he could almost see Carson scowling and hear Miss Hughes saying, Thomas! But nobody here shouted, Barrow! In a scandalized way. In fact, there was a sort of murmur of approval that Thomas didn't quite know how to respond to. On Lamble's other side, Rawkins, visibly choking back laughter, said, He's got you there, mate. Lambert looked crestfallen, and Thomas felt a wholly unfamiliar impulse to apologize, even though nobody was making him do it. Instead, he lit a cigarette. Rawkins, getting himself under control, said, But I was wondering about the Gunchy thing too. I think it's bloody brave signing up even though nobody expects you to. Lambert brightened up a bit at that, and Thomas quickly said, You're right. That touched off a murmur of agreement, and he figured that was apology enough. Another night, Thomas came in from smoking his after-dinner cigarette and was greeted with shouts of, There he is! A bit startled, he nearly took a step back, but then someone was shoving a tin cup of wine into his hand, so he shrugged and made his way to his spot. I was just telling them, explained Manning, who had been working on the men's surgical ward along with Thomas that day. Telling them what? Thomas was considering whether or not to ask when Manning went on. So the bloke had been banging on all morning about his wedding ring. RAMC really does stand for Rob's all my comrades. I'm going to write to the War Office about this, etc. Oh, that. And he starts up again when Barrow here goes up to get his bloody porridge basin. Where's my wedding ring? I know some bugger nicked it. Who was it? And Barrow goes, I'm sure it was just misplaced, old bean. Manning said the last part in a gloomy accent that Thomas supposed was meant to sound like him, although if he had ever in his life said the words old bean, he'd been taking the piss at the time. And Chip is all misplaced my ass, etc. Barrow buggers off for a while and I figure he's just doing the washing up but maybe having a smoking bloody piece of quiet. But then he gets back and he goes right up to the bugger and says, Would this by any chance be the ring in question, my good man? Thomas had not said that either, but he didn't argue. He'd actually said, Is this yours, sir? Which was worse, because the bloke was only a bloody corporal. So it is his, and is he grateful? No! Someone called out. No! Manning agreed. He starts up again. Where was it? Who took it? Was it you who took it? Did one of your mates take it? And then this magnificent bastard right here says, It was still on your hand, mate! Manning fell over laughing. It was still on his bloody hand! Thomas thought that the wine must have been going around for a while now because everyone seemed to find that as hilarious as Manning did. He was lucky, Thomas said, it hadn't gone into the incinerator yet. That apparently was hilarious too. How did you know where it was? Lamble asked him. I didn't, Thomas answered. I went to surgical prep and asked where it would have ended up if a man wearing a wedding ring had his left hand amputated. They couldn't find it, so there was only one place left to check. I don't think I could have done it, said Lamble, searching through all the severed limbs. He shuddered. There weren't that many of them, Thomas said. He had in fact been picturing an enormous pile of rotting severed limbs, and wouldn't have searched it if that's what it had been. But there was actually just a smallish bin by the incinerator. It was only about half full, and there had been only one left hand in it. He wasn't surprised. The surgical prep orderlies had missed it. The hand was pretty well mangled, the first two fingers missing entirely, and the ring finger a bloody stump. Scrubbing the gore off the ring had been a job and a half. Still, said Lamble. By this point, the general conversation had moved on to some other subject of hilarity, so Thomas admitted to the blokes nearby, What surprised me was that he cared about his wedding ring when his entire hand had just been chopped off. What was he planning to do with his wedding ring once he got it back? That happens, said Rawkins, the bloke on the next bedroll over, with the voice of experience. They're up to their eyeballs in morphine, you know, so the wounds don't really hurt. But in the back of their minds, they know something's wrong, and they pick something else to get upset about. I had this bloke once, both legs blown off,
I wouldn't shut up about how he had to go back to his regiment and get the 2 shillings 6pence that his mate owed him. You'd try to tell him, mate, you're going back to Blighty, don't worry about that now, and he'd say, all right, but first I've got to go back to the front and get my 2 and 6.
The Spirit of God then moved Lamble to tell them a long and rambling story about a great hand of his who, in her dotage, became obsessed with a doll she had lost as a child, which went on long after the time that everyone else had started to settle down into their bedrolls. The Spirit of God moved Thomas to heave his boots at him, but he restrained the impulse. From bedmaking and bedpans, Thomas moved on to dishing out the men's dinners and doing the washing up afterwards. He supposed it was a bit of a step up at any rate. Then he was rotated off wards for a spell and was assigned to be the orderly's room orderly. It was the first thing he'd had to do since he joined up that he genuinely loathed. At least apart from trying to sleep in a leaking, vermin-infested barn where at least you had the comfort of a dozen or so other blokes who hated it as much as you did. But being posted to the orderly's room was apparently supposed to be some kind of treat. Located in the former school building, most of the wards were in army huts. It was where the orderlies took their tea breaks and generally hung about when they didn't have anything better to do. But if you were posted there, you were essentially the tweenie. You had to make the tea and empty the ashtrays and sweep up all the ashes and cigarette ends left on the floor by blokes who were too filthy and lazy to use the ashtrays, and generally clean up after everybody. You also had to do the same things in the NCO's room, which was next door, but they also felt perfectly free to ask you to do any bit of their job they didn't feel like doing, or, if they caught you sitting down, clean their boots. The worst part of it, though, was that anytime anything mildly interesting happened anywhere in the vicinity, some bugger would run to the orderly's room to tell the story, and then keep on telling it to everyone else who came in, so that if you were in there all day, you ended up where you could tell it better than the bloke it had happened to. After about a week of this, the sergeants all happened to be elsewhere at the same time, and Corporal Diggs, one of the regular army men, scrawny and ferrety-looking, announced he was popping off on an important errand. You've got everything under control here, don't you, Barrow?
Thomas agreed that he did. Halfway out the door, he paused and said,
If the linen van comes before I'm back, you'll have to sign for it. Oh, and finish filling out the chitty for the pickup.
Then he buggered off before Thomas had a chance to say anything about it. That was a dirty trick, and Thomas knew it. Nearly every day the wardmaster tore Diggs a new arsehole over something to do with the linen delivery. The van was supposed to bring back the exact same number of each item as they picked up in the morning, but when the stuff was distributed back to the wards, there was always something missing. So the wardmaster would tell Diggs to insist that they make up the discrepancy the next time, but the linen van man would just pull out a clipboard, thumb through a mess of forms stuck to it, and show him where he'd signed, saying he'd got what he was supposed to get.
"Tosser,"
Thomas muttered at Diggs departing back. Sticking a cigarette in his mouth, he went to the heap of papers that Diggs liked to call his desk, and had a rummage through it, looking for the ones to do with today's linen. The forms that the ward corporals had turned in with their sacks of dirty linen were under a teacup with a half-inch of cold tea and a fag end floating in it, but if Diggs had even started filling out the chitty for the pickup, Thomas was buggered if he could find it. Finally, he found a supply of blank ones under a stack of old requisition forms and started filling out a fresh one. The running of a dressing station required 81 different kinds of linen, from tray cloths, officers for the use of, to bed sheets, hospital, to surgeon gowns. For each item, Thomas had to find the relevant figure on the form from each ward, add them all up, and enter the total on the chitty. It might not have been too difficult, except that people kept interrupting to ask if there was any tea, or to tell an amusing anecdote involving pus or an estaminet girl. He got it done moments before the linen van pulled up, and then had to leave the linen van man standing there while he dug through Diggs's rubbish heap looking for their copy of yesterday's chitty. When he finally found it, he had to help the linen van man pull the sacks out of the back of the van, which apparently he could not have done while Thomas was looking for the sagging chitty, and then opened them up to check that they actually contained what their labels claimed they did.
"We're short 2 bolster cases here," he said.
"No, you ain't,"
said the linen van man.
"Yes, we are. We gave you 57 yesterday. There were only 55 here."
Thomas brandished the form. Scowling suspiciously, the linen van man thumbed through his own collection of forms.
It's going to say the same thing mine does,
Thomas pointed out, did he not understand how carbon paper worked. After much squinting at the form, the linen van man confirmed that it did look as though his copy said 57 as well.
And what do you propose we remedy this situation?
What?
What are we going to do about it?
The linen van man considered. There's not more in the van.
Of course not. That would make things entirely too easy. Suppose we write on the chitty that we're owed two?
He suggested. He had never noticed Diggs doing anything of the kind, but he didn't have any better ideas. Eventually, the linen van man agreed to this course of action, which they repeated when it came to towels, surgical, of which they were short 6, and mattress cases officers, where only one was missing. Thomas carefully made the emendations on both his and the linen van man's copies of the chitty, and required that the linen van man initial them. For good measure, he wrote +2, +6, and +1 in the appropriate columns of the new chitty, and made him initial those too. When the linen van man finally left, he'd have liked to sit down for a cup of tea, or even a nap, but the next bit was sorting out the linen into piles for the wards to pick up. At least that was the way it was supposed to be done, but half the time Diggs couldn't be arsed to find the forms from the previous day and just told Thomas to put everything in stacks by type of item, and then told the wards to grab what was owing to them. So he jammed another cigarette into his mouth and went for another rummage through Diggs' desk. Yesterday's forms from the ward, instead of being filed under a cup of tea, as today's had been, were kept under a plate containing several smears of jam. Clearly, he was too inexperienced to understand the intricacies of Diggs' system. He was getting on with the sorting, piles of linen spread out all over the storeroom, when Corporal Jessup stuck his head in.
Barrow, is there any...
He stopped, perhaps noticing Thomas's thunderous expression. Where's Diggs?
Stepped out,
said Thomas flatly.
Ah,
Jessup nodded.
I'll just put the kettle on myself, why don't I?
He didn't say it sarcastically, so Thomas answered,
If you don't mind.
Diggs still wasn't back by the time the ward orderlies started showing up to collect their clean linen, so Thomas was left to hand everything out and initial their chits, which would be straightforward enough until he got to somebody who was supposed to get something that was missing. The one who came down from the officers' ward, and so was supposed to receive the officers' mattress cases, of which they were one short, was Lamble, the chatty Quaker. When Thomas explained about how he'd been writing the discrepancies on the chits and initialing them. Is that what you're meant to do when something's missing? Lamble asked.
I haven't a sodding clue,
Thomas told him. Only Corporal Diggs never does.
Well, he's buggered off and left it to me, so I'm making it up as I go along.
Right, said Lamble, quickly initialing his chit and giving it back. Better you than me, mate. Then things went smoothly until the bloke from surgery turned up and Thomas had to explain about the towels. He was still in the middle of it when the ward master came in. He was a stocky man of about Lord Grantham's vintage, not overly tall, but with an imposing presence. Thomas immediately stopped what he was saying and stood up straight. You didn't come to attention for an NCO, even the most senior one in the unit, but you were supposed to show you noticed somebody important was in the room. Bracing up, they called it.
Where the fuck is Diggs?
Asked the War Master.
Stepped out, Sergeant,
Thomas said smartly.
Right here,
said Diggs, turning up seemingly out of nowhere.
Everything all correct.
The way he said it was just enough of a question that, when the discrepancy appeared, you could say he'd been asking Thomas to confirm it. So Thomas, on the theory that a bollocking delayed was a bollocking doubled, said,
We're missing 2 bolster cases, 6 surgical towers, and an officer's mattress case.
Diggs glanced over the stack of linen still before them.
How do you know that?
He asked suspiciously.
I expect you fucking counted it,
said the ward master scathingly.
Where's the sorted chitty?
While Diggs started to mutter something about his desk, Thomas produced it. The ward master snatched it out of his hand and examined it.
What the fuck's this?
He asked Diggs, jabbing a finger at a part of the page.
Don't know, Sarge, said Diggs, but that bit looks like Barrow's initials.
There was a murmur from the crowd of orderlies waiting for their linen. Diggs had just dropped his mate in the shit, which was an offense slightly worse than nicking somebody's last cigarette, and only a little better than murder. The wardmaster turned to him and pointed to a spot on the form again, which was, of course, one of the places where Thomas had written in about one of the missing items.
What the fuck is this?
He repeated. Well, Sergeant, he said, thinking quickly. There really wasn't anything he could say other than the truth, was there? I wrote in the items that were short and had the linen van man initial by them, so we wouldn't be able to say we'd had them when we hadn't. I wasn't sure where to find the proper form for it, so that's what I did.
There isn't a fucking form for it because it isn't supposed to fucking happen,
said the wardmaster. It was hardly his fault it had, but there was no reason that should suddenly start to matter now when he never had before in his life.
Yes, Sergeant.
The wardmaster looked at the form again.
Are you fucking telling me, he said, the Biggs stepped out long enough for you to get the linen delivery, count it, and convince the fucking linen man bugger to initial your fucking chitty?
Thomas could not answer that question without also dropping his mate in the shit, so he braced up and said,
Sergeant, and how long have you been in this fucking shithole?
About a month, Sergeant. He wasn't sure what that had to do with anything. The wardmaster turned to Diggs, his mouth working soundlessly. Finally, he said,
You useless nitwit!
It was the first utterance Thomas had ever heard from him that did not contain the word fuck or one of its close relations. He got the sense that if the wardmaster had called Diggs a fucking useless nitwit, it would mean he was less angry than he was. A cavernous silence yawned through the room. When one of the ward orderlies finally broke about asking timidly if he could have the linen for men's sick, Thomas hurried to give it to him. He really didn't want to say it, but what choice did he have?
You're sure to bolster the case, mate,
he said quietly. With a wary sidelong glance at the wardmaster, the orderly proffered his chitty. He had been waiting long enough to see that Thomas had been initialing them. Thomas also looked warily at the wardmaster.
Yes, put your fucking initials on it, he said. You should probably do both fucking copies.
I have been, Sergeant, said Thomas quietly.
Fuck,
said the wardmaster and departed. Some time later, Thomas was sweeping the orderly's room when Diggs came in.
I wants to see you,
he muttered, jerking his thumb in the general direction of the wardmaster's room. Thomas just bet he fucking did. He went to put the broom away, but Diggs took it out of his hand, and as he left the room, he heard the sound of hasty sweeping. Thomas had never been in the wardmaster's room before. It combined the roles of office and sitting room with a large table at one end, used as a desk, and at the other a fireplace and two battered armchairs. Rumor had it that particularly favored orderlies were occasionally invited to sit in the second of these and drink the wardmaster's liquor. Right now, the wardmaster was at the desk end of it, of course. Bracing up square in front of the desk, Thomas said, Sergeant, if Diggs got demoted to sweeping the floor after this fiasco, God alone knew what was going to happen to him. Digging latrines, maybe. He couldn't think of anything he could have done better than he had, but it was a well-established maxim of army life that shit rolled downward.
Right, said the wardmaster. What the fuck happened today? And don't worry about dropping that mugger in the shit, he's already in it.
So Thomas explained.
You did the fucking pick-up chitty too?
The wardmaster asked when he'd finished.
Yes, Sergeant.
The wardmaster leaned back in his chair.
What did you do before you joined the fucking scene?
I was a footman, Sergeant.
Fuck, why didn't you say something? We could have put you on the fucking Rupert's ward.
Well, no one had asked, had they?
Sergeant?
The wardmaster lit a cigarette.
You know you don't have to say that unless you're getting a fucking bollocking.
Thomas had thought he was. Since he couldn't think of any reply other than Sergeant, he said nothing.
You do this kind of shit as a fucking footman?
What kind of shit?
Sergeant? Deliveries,
he clarified. Oh.
Yes, well, the butler is in charge of them, but I assist him.
That was how he'd known he was supposed to fucking count it, even though he'd never seen Diggs do it.
Right then,
said the wardmaster, nodding decisively.
You're fucking linen waller till you go back on wards. Justin will show you out. He did it before Diggs.
Yes, Sergeant. Was that better or worse than digging latrines? It was certainly cleaner at any rate.
And you'd better be a lance corporal, he decided. There's no fucking pay in it, but it'll keep Diggs off your ass.
Thomas doubted very much that that would do it, was in fact fairly sure that Diggs would want to have his balls in a bag, but said only, "Here, Sergeant." When he got back to the orderly room, Diggs was explaining to all present that he was now orderly's room corporal, in charge of making sure you buggers don't treat the place like a pig pen. It was a job somebody probably ought to have been doing, but Thomas had his doubts that the wardmaster had put it to Diggs in precisely that way. "So you don't have to do the linen anymore?" someone asked. "No, it's not that responsible a job. Anyone can do it." Thomas didn't argue the point, just went to find Jessup.
"Just suppose,"
Wardmaster Tooley asked thoughtfully, opening the door to his office and ushering Corporal Jessup inside,
"that Diggs has the mother wit to realize he's in the fucking doghouse, or is he just off seeing his fucking hole?"
"Hard to say," Jessup said, lighting the candles to either side of Tooley's mantelpiece. They'd just come from the mess, and Diggs had indeed not shown his face, but that could be for either of the reasons Tooley had mentioned.
"I know it's hard to say, that's why I fucking asked,"
Tooley said, going into his desk drawer for a bottle of liquor.
"If he doesn't shape up soon, I'm gonna have to do something we'll both fucking regret."
With a sigh, he dropped into one of the easy chairs in front of his fireplace and contemplated his boots for a moment.
"You get the Polish fucker sorted out."
Jessup nodded.
"He'll do. Diggs has been foisting bits of the job off on him all week. I just have to show him how it all connects up, and help him figure out where Dig keeps the farms." "Huh."
Tooley sat up and poured the liquor into two mostly clean glasses, handing one to Jessup.
"So what you think of this? Picked up a case of it in Paris."
Jessup tasted his cautiously. Tooley had poured the stuff out like it was water and was already halfway into his glass, but that didn't mean much. All Jessup really noticed about it was that it burned on the way down. Give him a pint any day.
"That'll put that on your chest." "I'm still getting used to it,"
Tooley said, refilling his glass. He tipped the bottle towards Jessup, but Jessup waved it off. He'd learned back in South Africa that trying to match Tooley drink for drink was a fool's game.
"What'd you make of him then? The lad?"
He was lad now, and not posh fecker. Jessup put more thought into his answer than he had the one about the liquor.
"Well, he's not afraid of a bit of hog graft. Hasn't bucked at anything we've thrown at him yet. Not even when Diggs asked him to clean his boots." "Diggs should clean his own fucking boots,"
Tooley observed.
"Aye, he's quick."
Jessup continued, returning to the subject of Barrow.
"Could be too quick for his own good if he isn't kept busy."
Tooley knew as well as he did that the clever ones could make a lot of trouble for themselves if they had too much time on their hands. Like a sharp working dog penned up in the front parlor, they'd find something to do. Tooley managed to find quite a bit of trouble himself before he'd had the luck to come under an NCO with the sense to point him at a flock of sheep and let him run.
"Bit standoffish, but the rest of the new lads seem to have decided he's all right."
Jessup wasn't sure if young Manning had noticed yet that he'd been eclipsed as ringleader of that little group, or if Barrow had, for that matter.
"Doesn't say much, you know, but when he does, they sit up and take notice."
Tooley nodded.
"Sworn to thought. In my considered opinion, he's worth the fucking watch."
He filled his glass again.
"Did he ever mention what he did before the war?"
Jessup shook his head.
"Not that I've heard, but that accent of his slips from time to time, and if he's not a Yorkshire tyke, he's bloody Nass man was."
Before Jessup was halfway through speaking, Tooley started grinning.
"You're going to fucking love this."
"What?"
"I was a fucking footman."
"Blimey!" Jessup would never have guessed that, but now that Tooley said it, it explained everything. Why, he talked like he'd just come out of a public school, except when he forgot to, and still like he'd been born on a parade ground, but took to hard work like he'd been doing it all his life. Because he likely had.
Not such a posh fucker after all, then.
"Nope," said Tooley, popping the pea.
"I's one they won't be taken away from us for officers' training."
That had happened a couple of times already this war, with lads the brass hats had picked out for NCO training. Tooley had been equally furious at having them foisted on him.
"They think going to a minor fucking public school is what makes an NCO."
And at having them transferred away to supposedly better things, just when he'd started to
make some fucking progress with them.
It was early days yet to be thinking of pushing Barrow up the ladder, but Tooley was always thinking 6 or 8 steps ahead.
That's why he was a master sergeant, and Jessup had stayed a corporal his whole career. Tooley made the plans, Jessup carried them out. It had been that way since South Africa.
What do we do? What now? See how he does his linen waller. I made him up to Lance Corporal, by the way. I know it's early, but I don't want him cleaning Deg's fucking boats. Don't give him any responsibilities in the section yet. The other new lads would bucket that, and I wouldn't blame him. And if he starts getting too big for his boots, dump him down. Or send him to me for a thumping if you're too soft. He shrugged. Apart from that, you know what to do. If the linen job isn't keeping him busy, find more for him to do. Show him anything that comes up that you think he ought to see.
Jessup nodded. He did know. We still haven't set the new lads forward, he reminded Tooley. We'll want to see how he handles that before we get too far along. Plenty of men did well enough on wards and at administrative work, but fell apart under fire.
Right,
said Tooley.
been meaning to do that. We'll put them on the list for stretcher parties next week. Pick a few steady blokes to mix in with them. Then we'll see.
I've had a letter from Thomas, Miss Hughes announced at dinner. He says he's been able to make a good impression on the man in charge where he is now, and he has you to thank for it, Mr. Carson.
Said Mr. Carson.
He wrote me a bit about that as well, Anna said. He'd also mentioned Mr. Carson, but it had been something on the order of, it turns out having old Carson riding me all these years has been excellent preparation for military life. He's been made a lance corporal again, and something called linen waller.
That's all me talk,
Mr. Bates said,
for the chap in charge or something.
Well, I'm sure that's a very responsible job in a hospital, Miss Hughes said. Don't you think? She asked Mr. Carson.
I suppose, he said. I'm not sure what I can have had to do with it, though.
Apparently there was some sort of mix-up and he ended up having to take responsibility for a delivery, Miss Hughes explained. It involved checking that everything is correct, as you do with the wine deliveries, Mr. Carson, and it seems he had less difficulty with it than the man who had been doing it before.
This bloke called Diggs ran off and left me to do it on my own, Thomas had written to her, and I wasn't too happy because he's always getting in trouble for doing it wrong. But it turns out the problem is half the time he's too lazy to check the delivery when it comes, and the other half he's too thick to count correctly. It doesn't seem like it would be difficult, Mr. Carson said. And apparently, Thomas had gone on, some people find it difficult to tell the difference between, say, a pillow slip and a pillowcase, which is just that one's got buttons on it. I'd like to put them in front of Carson and see them confuse a luncheon napkin for a dinner one or a pudding wine glass for a cordial glass. That's not a mistake you make twice. I think it's to do with attention to detail, Anna said, being able to tell the different items apart at a glance like. Carson still didn't look impressed, but said, if I have been able to be a positive influence on him, I'm glad of it, though I could wish it had shown up while he was still here.
Miss Hughes said quickly, I've been wondering, Mr. Bates, what exactly is a lance corporal? I suppose it's a promotion?
Sort of, Mr. Bates said. It's considered an appointment rather than a rank. When they need to give someone a bit of extra authority, temporarily or for a specific reason, they make him a lance corporal.
Thomas says it's basically a private with nubs on, Anna added. Down the table, one of the hall boys snickered, stopping abruptly when he received a quelling glance from Mr. Carson. A glorified private, Mr. Bates suggested. So it's not a real promotion, then? William asked. Mr. Bates made an equivocating gesture.
It's not a formal promotion, but at this point, a month in active service, it's impressive. If he were made a full corporal at this stage, it would be astonishing.
He was one in training, too, Anna pointed out. Twice.
It means a bit more on active service,
Mr. Bates said. He sighed.
I wouldn't tell him this, but my guess would be that unless they've lost a lot of men recently, they're considering whether he's NCO material.
His tone was unmistakably dubious.
Non-commissioned officer, that is.
An officer? Daisy asked. Like Mr. Matthew? No, said Madge, scornfully, with all the authority of her few months as a soldier's fiancé. Mr. Matthew's a commissioned officer. You've got to be a gentleman for that. More kindly, Mr. Bates explained,
NCOs come up through the ranks, like, well, me. I was a sergeant.
Anna had the distinct impression that it cost Mr. Bates something to make that comparison.
He had warmed up to Thomas, but seemed to have managed it by thinking of Thomas as a little younger than he really was, and in need of guidance. "Oh," said Daisy, "that makes more sense."
The way it works is, the commissioned officers tell us what needs to be done, and then we tell the men how to do it,"
Mr. Bates added.
"You might say his lordship and her ladyship are the officers of the house, and Mr. Carson, Miss Hughes, and Miss Patmore are the NCOs.
Mr. Carson cleared his throat.
Mr. Carson, of course, would be the master sergeant,"
Mr. Bates added quickly.
"and as head housemaid, Anna might be equivalent to a corporal."
"I think I understand now," said Daisy. "But then wasn't Thomas already sort of a corporal, as first footman?" Mr. Carson sighed heavily.
"Yes,"
said Mr. Bates,
"but now he's one in the army. Sort of, like how Miss Bird stepped in while Miss Patmore was away."
"Oh, when Thomas stepped in as valet," Miss O'Brien pointed out. Anna wondered if perhaps she was softening a bit towards Thomas, but then she added, "That didn't last long." Mr. Bates said,
"If they are sizing him up for corporal stripes, one of the things they'll be watching is how he handles going back down to private. And if he makes too much of his little bit of authority while he has it, that'll be the tricky part for him."
That, Anna thought, was a detail she might try to find a way to pass along in her next letter. Thomas did do better when things like that were spelled out for him. 10th of September, 1915.
"Dear Theo, yes, there's rumours here about a big show in the works, but then there always are."
A show, of course, was an offensive, or push, but at the moment the censors weren't letting either of those words through, which probably meant there was something to the rumors. They'd had a medical officer and a few orderlies seconded away to other units, which made Thomas think the push wasn't happening here. But you weren't allowed to put something like that in a letter in case the Germans got hold of it somehow. He went on,
"Only one I've really heard from is Reg. He's in a quiet sector and is doing all right, except for having been shocked by all the licentiousness at the company baths."
Company baths could be a fairly tricky matter for their sort. You had to hand in your clothes to be fumigated first thing, so then you were standing around bollocks naked with everyone else bollocks naked as well, waiting for your turn in a tub, and then stand around some more afterwards waiting for the clothes to be handed back out. There was a great deal of horseplay and lewd joking. Company baths were housed at the main dressing station, which meant if you worked there, you had a bit more of an opportunity to make your own hygienic arrangements, but in turn you sometimes had to supervise the baths, which meant standing there fully clothed looking at a bunch of naked blokes and sometimes shouting at the Shire ones to hurry up and take their kit off. Thomas did not find the spectacle a particularly erratic one, but he was always afraid someone would think he did.
"I also had a field postcard from Joey. Quite well. I'd sent him a few letters, so I suppose he doesn't have time to write."
He hadn't had a letter saying anyone had died since he got to France. He wasn't sure if that was because no one had, or because Theo wasn't passing news along as much as he always had. He'd been in a funk since Syl died, and his last letter had said that he was finally on his way back to his unit after a long convalescence from his wound.
"Being Glenenwaller isn't bad as long as you know how to count. The hours are quite regular, and on days no convoy is expected, you can bugger off to your billet for a rest before dinner. I'm there now and quite cosy."
In fact, it was raining, nearly as heavily inside the barn as out, and he was sitting with his ground sheet wrapped round his shoulders and pulled over his head to protect the paper it was writing on. But if Theo was back at the front when he got this, he'd envy the barn. And besides, this letter was meant to be cheering him up.
"I've done carrying parties twice now, both on quiet nights. The first time we just went to the collecting post, which is in about the third line back, and the other time up to the regimental aid post. I have an idea where everything is now, is about all I can say about that."
The work hadn't been particularly frightening. They were quiet nights, but it was fairly depressing trudging through filthy holes in the ground and knowing that scores of men had to live and work in them. It made you appreciate being far enough back to live above the surface of the earth, even though the mud still got everywhere. He was considering what to write next when Rawlkins, one of his billet mates, came in. He looked around with an expression of distaste and said, "Blimey, I think it's drier outside. Want to chum up?"
"All right,"
Thomas said. That meant sharing your ground sheets so that you both sat on one and had the other over your heads. It was slightly more comfortable than going it on your own, where you had to decide whether it was more important to have the waterproof material under you or over you.
You got up top, Roland said. Mine's been folded up, so it's mostly dry. Here.
He tossed Thomas a bundle of cord that he must have organized from somewhere, a useful article to have when it came to chumming up, since if you were clever, it could save you having to hold up the roof over your head. Once Thomas had unwrapped himself from his ground sheet, Rawlkins took charge of tacking one end to the wall, just above head level for a seated man, and Thomas used the cord to tie the other end to some nearby stanchions, or whatever they were. Thomas was proudly ignorant of agricultural furniture. Rawlkins spread out his ground sheet on the barn floor, and they crawled inside and made themselves comfortable as they could. This type of shelter was just large enough for two men to sit shoulder to shoulder, as long as you didn't mind being pressed up against one another. Every time Thomas got into one, he was aware, at the back of his mind, that he could not allow himself to think of how pleasant it would be if he was sharing one with Peter. Thomas got back to his letter, and Rawlkins lit his pipe and got out a book. He didn't seem able to keep his attention on it, though, and soon lowered it and said, "It's going to be a little bugger if we're still in this barn when winter comes."
"You're right,"
Thomas agreed.
"I've looked round for something better, but every hole I can find has already got somebody living in it. Perhaps they'll give us tents,"
Thomas said, "for winter." Rawlkins frowned and waggled his hand from side to side.
"This might keep the wind out better than a tent,"
Thomas elaborated.
"We put the tents up inside the barn."
"Oh," he said.
"That's not a bad idea. I haven't figured out yet who I could suggest it to."
Rawlkins returned to his book, and Thomas wrote a few lines disparaging the quality of the food they'd had lately.
"The woodmaster likes you,"
Rawlkins said suddenly. It took Thomas a moment to realize he must be going back to the subject of who Thomas could tell his idea about the tents.
"I wouldn't go that far. He made you lance corporal when you were only here a month,"
Rawlkins pointed out. Thomas was trying not to make a thing out of that. Anna had pointed out in her last letter that the men who'd been here longer might feel just about the way he had about Bates swooping in and getting the valet job out of nowhere.
"Just till we go back on wards,"
which was due to happen in about a week anyway.
"Still,"
Thomas shrugged and lit a cigarette. When it seemed that Rawlkins was done talking for the moment, he turned his attention back to the letter and wrote,
"I hope you're managing all right."
That didn't seem like quite enough, but he couldn't think of any more to say, so he just signed, "Affectionately, TB." When he'd folded the letter, stuck it in the envelope, and addressed it, Rawlkins tossed down his book again.
"Bugger this," he said. "Let's go for a drink."
Thomas considered this. The estaminets would be crowded and noisy and stinking of wet wool, but at least it wouldn't be raining indoors.
"Yeah, all right."
They buttoned up their tunics, found their caps, and set off.
"Which place do you like?"
Rawlkins asked.
"I think I might want something to eat, too." "Don't really have a favourite yet,"
Thomas said. He'd only been out a few times, each with a group that had a destination in mind. As far as he'd seen, all of the estaminets, little pubs/cafes, were similar, except that some were also whorehouses and some weren't.
"I don't have a lot of money,"
he added. Some of the others had extra sent to them from home and ate more often at estaminets than they did in the mess. Rawlkins, with his vaguely middle-class accent, was probably one of those.
"Lily'll do you an egg and chips and a glass of watered-down beer for under a shilling, with looking at the girls thrown in gratis,"
Rawlkins said.
"Or you can go to Granny's, where the only female in the place is about 900 years old and has hair on her chin, but for the same price, you can get a jug of wine and a big plate of whatever she feels like cooking. I had some chicken stew there once that tasted like it had been seasoned by God himself."
After pretending to consider it for a moment, Thomas said,
"I think I fancy the one with the food. The ones with girls don't really let you hang around for long unless you at least keep buying drinks, do they?" "Do right," said Rawlkins. "This way."
The estaminet was in the front room of a peasant cottage, with smoke-blackened timbers holding up the roof and scarred wooden tables crammed in cheek by jowl. Most of these were occupied, though Thomas didn't see anyone he recognized. In addition to the 47th Ambulance, this area housed a munition store, a rest camp, a transport depot, and a number of smaller military establishments, so there were always people coming and going. Rawlkins spotted a free table, and they picked their way through a maze of tables, chairs, and outstretched legs to claim it. A little old man was likewise weaving his way through the room, depositing crockery pitchers on tables. Running up round to them, Rawkins said, "Bottle of Blanc and 2 plates danger." Place de jour, surely, Thomas thought, but didn't ask. The Blanc was vin blanc to the civilized. Still, the man seemed to understand what they wanted and held up his fingers to indicate what they owed. Once they'd paid up and the man had gone, Rawkins leaned back, lit his pipe, and asked, "Who were you always writing to, anyway? Got a girl?" "No," Thomas said, lighting a cigarette. "I write to lots of people. Mates, people for me old job, my sister." "Oh, well, it's nice getting letters. Gives you something to look forward to." "That's why I do it," Thomas agreed. It was why he always had, even back at Downton. "You?" "Huh? Girl," Thomas clarified. "Oh, nah, just as well, really. It only worries them you being over here." Thomas had wondered a time or two if Rawkins might be a candidate for the peculiars, but that sounded more like there was a girl, but he didn't fancy him back. "They're right. How come you don't usually go out with the lads then, if you weren't being true to your girl at home?" Thomas shrugged. People did ask you personal questions, like it was nothing in the army he was finding. "I'm not really used to it," he answered. "I was in service back home, and you don't come and go as you please. You get your half day every other week, and that's it." "Blimey," said Rawkins. "Imagine going into the army and having more free time than you're used to." "What'd you do before the war?" "Office boy," said Rawkins. "My father's a manager at a place that makes papers, so he got me a job there. Supposedly I'm being groomed for junior management, but I'm not as keen as they'd like me to be, so mostly I just fetch things and take notes at meetings." Thomas had been right about his class then. Middle class, but barely. "Doesn't sound too interesting," he said. "Won't he let you do something else?" He'd heard that some people's fathers were firm on the subject of them going into the family trade. "He might if I had a decent idea of what I'd like to do instead," Rawkins answered. "He was all for my joining up. Hoped it would give me some direction in life." "Has he?" Thomas asked. "Yeah, rearward," he chuckled, adding, "I don't really mind going up, of course." You had to say that, Thomas knew, so you didn't seem like a coward. "Hasn't been too bad the times I've gone," he noted. "No, there was about a month in the late spring that wasn't good, when the Hun had their push up at Whippers. We don't get casualties from that far away, do we?" Thomas asked. Surely they'd be moved rearward toward the base hospital, not down the line to a different sector's main dressing station. Rawkins shook their head. "When there's a push, they do raids and smaller attacks all down the line, so the Kaiser can't move all of his regiments to the big show." The little old man brought their wine, and Rawkins sloshed it into 2 cups. "It'll be like that with the one coming up." They talked about the upcoming push for a while, both agreeing that one was certain to happen soon. It had to if they weren't going to spend the next winter dug into more or less the same spots they'd spent the last one, but that it wouldn't be happening here. They'd have noticed the build-up if it was, and instead, men and material were being moved away. Rawkins was mates with one of the men who'd been seconded to another unit, and knew that he'd gone to the 6th ambulance, but not where it was posted. When they'd exhausted that subject, Rawkins asked, "Say, what was going through your head when you did that thing with the hand?" Thomas shrugged. "I don't know. It was ages ago." Once or twice, when he'd been assigned to work with men he didn't know, he'd noticed someone pointing him out to someone else as the new chap who found the hand. He wasn't sure why it was considered such a memorable story. An amputation wasn't a particularly gruesome wound. "Well, we all thought it was bloody impressive," Rawkins confided. "Especially coming from a new bloke. And then the way you played it off like it was nothing." He made an admiring sound. "Some of the 1914ers thought you must have transferred in from a combat unit to be that cool-headed about it." 1914ers were men who had joined up at the start of the war, and who had been in France or Belgium by the end of 1914. While a considerable step below the regular army blokes in experience and prestige, they were an equally considerable step above the new blokes, which, outside of the barn at least, included anyone who had come over in 1915, no matter how early in the year. "It was a lot less disgusting than cramming somebody's guts back into his belly or trying to bandage up a face with a jaw blown off," he said. "And we all do that." "Well, sure," said Rawkins, "but that's usually middle of an emergency. Your blood's pumping and you've got to do it right then if the poor bastard's going to have any kind of a chance. It's a bit different going off to have a rummage through a pile of severed limbs in between picking up the breakfast dishes and washing them. Thomas was fairly sure he'd washed the dishes first, but he supposed that didn't matter. It didn't bother me. Wildcats looked skeptical about that, but Thomas wasn't sure why. In any case, they dropped the subject when the little old man came back with their food. It was a bowl of soup and a sandwich each, and Thomas wondered if Rawkins had perhaps overstated the quality of the cooking here, just a tad. It only took a bite of the sandwich to know that he hadn't. It was a ham and cheese sandwich, but made on fried bread, and the cheese was some rich and gooey kind. "Blimey," he said once he'd swallowed. "Try the soup," Rawkins advised. It looked like split pea, a kind Thomas didn't particularly like, but it was delicious. Like eating green velvet, if green velvet was food and didn't mostly taste of dust. "I want to marry this 900-year-old Harry-chinned mummy," Thomas declared. "I'm pretty sure the waiter's her husband," Rawkins said. "Otherwise, you'd have to get in line." They ate contentedly for a while until Rawkins paused for breath and said, "Maybe keep this place under your hat, though, right? It's crowded enough already." "They're right," Thomas said. "I'm surprised the officers haven't bagsied it." When the officers decided they liked a place, they declared it off limits to the other ranks. As far as Thomas could tell, he was the only one who was in the habit of drinking with his social superiors, and so no one else objected to this in principle. Although they did object in the particulars when an estimate they liked was taken out of bounds.
"Rumour has it they've got one where the old lady is just as good a cook, but has a pretty granddaughter to boot," Rawkins said. "But yeah, that's another reason not to spread it around."
Taking another bite of the heavenly sandwich, Thomas decided that if this place went on the forbidden list, he'd write to Branson for some socialist pamphlets and stage a revolution.